to newsagents.
Good evening and welcome. It was Iran who struck tonight in the ever-spiraling cycle of violence in the Middle East. The U.S. says around 200 Iranian ballistic missiles launched from Iran rained down across Israel this evening, sending people running for cover. Just moments after.
And you could watch it live on TV. The missiles coming in, the shrapnel everywhere, the explosions in the distance. And yet, at the end of it, one Palestinian died in the West Bank and a few others suffered light injuries. So was this an Iranian misfire or Israeli success or something else?
Iran says the attack was a response to the killing by Israel of Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hizbollah, head of that Iranian-backed militia in Lebanon. And we are trying to work out now what the next move will be in this extraordinary outbreak of war, which has seen Lebanon invaded, Israel hit, and the world holding its breath. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily. And a little bit later, we're going to catch up with Lewis Goodall.
Where is he? Did he miss the train?
He missed the train. He slept in. No, he's actually been listening to the last round of the leadership speeches. It was a sort of culmination today at the Tory party conference where you heard from each of them, one after another, on the main stage before it goes to that final vote, which ends up with two candidates being put forward to the Conservative membership. That's to come.
So let us start, though, with the events last night across Israel, where with very little notice and little warning, suddenly Iran launches a massive ballistic missile attack, very different in character from the one in April, which seemed much more symbolic. This seemed for real. This seemed out of anger, targeting Israeli military sites and some kind of military headquarters like the Mossad headquarters, the spy HQ of Israel. And it involved not just Israeli defence systems, but the UK, the RAF was involved, and the US Navy.
Yeah, there was a clip of Keir Starmer shortly after 7 o'clock being asked about the role that the UK forces had or hadn't played, and he wouldn't say anything. He stuck to script. Several hours after that, the Defence Secretary John Healey confirmed that British forces had played their part, his words, in attempts to prevent further escalation in the Middle East. We don't know what that means, right?
Yes, exactly. We don't know whether the RAF jets shot down missiles, whether it was alerting Israel with their air defence systems, what it was. The RAF played a role, but hard to determine exactly what that means at the moment because the government's not saying much.
If you think about where we've been for the last, decades really, it's all hinged on this relationship between Israel and Iran. You know, Iran famously wants to see Israel knocked into the sea, cease to exist. And I think that's why you've got this uniform response from Western leaders saying this is an existential threat for Israel. We believe in Israel's right to exist, therefore we will defend it at this point. We don't know what Israel's next move will be, and we don't know whether Western leaders will condone a big move from Israel. It's interesting that Iran, I think, warned Russia before it struck. Just trying to alert yet another axis that this was going on.
Yes, and what Iran has done is it's got its kind of front line of defence, which was Hamas in Gaza and particularly Hizbollah in Lebanon, which was massively armed by the Iranians. And Israel, over the past 2 weeks, has systematically decapitated the leadership and done great damage to its fighting abilities and destroyed a huge number of those missiles and launchers that they had. And so Iran maybe thought, actually, that frontline defence isn't as solid as we thought it was. We now need to attack ourselves. But let us speak now to Mark Urban, former diplomatic editor at Newsnight and now Sunday Times columnist, an all-round expert on defence and diplomacy. So, Mark, just take us through what happened last night, how effective the Iron Dome was, what we learnt.
I think the Israeli figure of 181 ballistic missiles fired at them is accurate. There's no reason to doubt it. That's what seems to be accepted. The question about how many of them got through is a really complicated question because the kind of fire control for all these air defence systems in a fraction of a second works out the trajectory, which one is going to hit in the open desert, which one is going to hit Mossad headquarters, that kind of thing, therefore which one to engage. But there's a bit of a wrinkle, which is that the Iranians used very modern, their best medium-range ballistic missiles last night. And some of these have what are called manoeuvrable re-entry vehicles. So when you work out the track as it's coming in, they can pivot and they can wrong foot you. So that's a long and technical way of saying that probably quite a few got through. I would think dozens, if not scores, got through to their intended targets, which were, by and large, Israeli air bases. So then they start landing, and you've seen the spectacular footage of these sort of showers of re-entry vehicles coming down, particularly on the Netavim air base. And then the question is, well, what effect did it have? And the answer is, well, those air bases, they are very hard. They are concrete. The command and everything are in bunkers. Most of the aircraft are in concrete shelters. So even if your missile drops 200-300 meters away, it's probably going to have no effect. And so then we get to the point about accuracy, and we know that when they were aiming for a pinpoint, the Mossad headquarters, the nearest missile was 500 meters away. Well, that's okay if you want to damage something like an oil refinery or an airport or something like that. But if you want to hit a specific building or an aeroplane on the tarmac, that's not going to do it.
Mark, will you just talk us through the actual operation where the whole, basically, civilian population goes underground? I mean, everyone has, they have communal bunkers, or they have them in their gardens or their houses, or
do have communal shelters,
and they get it's like an air raid warning from the government, right?
They do, on the which is most people get via an app. So this Code Red thing, it's called. And I mean, look, I think.
And what do they have down there? I mean, do they have beds? Do they have food? Is there water?
I think generally not. But I mean, I'm sure it varies depending on where you are. But I certainly in the days after October the 7th, once or twice had to immediately get into these roadside shelters, which are literally just concrete shells. That, listen, you'd rather be in there than out when things are happening, but you don't want to spend very long in there. I think, though, this is all a measure of the degree to which this is a country, because of where it is and everything that's happened, that takes all this stuff really seriously. And of course has these various systems. Everybody says Iron Dome, but that's just the sort of system against short-range missiles. They have something called David Sling. They have something called Arrow, which are really capable long-range interceptors. So they have a whole family of interceptor missiles. They have ways of protecting the civilian population. And all of this means that they are a harder country to harm than, say, the UK, which has virtually none of that.
So, look, we've heard of accounts that there were only a few people who suffered minor injuries, hit by a bit of shrapnel or whatever.
Well, there was a Palestinian killed in the West Bank by a falling missile body, but that is believed to be the only person who died.
Do we,
apart from the terrorist attack, actually, that happened simultaneously on the streets of Tel Aviv, right? Which sounds like it took out more people than the Iranian missiles, right?
Yes.
But do we believe Israeli accounts when they, they'll say, oh, well, damage has been minimal and some of this is fake news and whatever? Are Israel giving a fully frank account of what happened?
I think we should believe them when they say damage has been minimal, because unless something crops up, one of these nerds who studies the satellite imagery, and we see, an aeroplane in ashes on the apron of one of those air bases, we don't think that's happened. But unless something like that crops up, I think it's fair to say that these 181 missiles did not destroy anything of military value. I think where the Israeli account might become less reliable is if you hear people saying most were stopped by defences. I mean, we really don't know what proportion of them got through the defences. And that's further complicated by the fact that obviously when this incoming re-entry vehicle is not manoeuvring, if it's heading for open desert, they don't even try, because obviously the interceptor missiles are very expensive. They don't even try to intercept it. So we can imagine that a lot of these missiles did get through, some because they were headed nowhere special, and others because they successfully evaded the interceptors.
So that was last night.
Yeah.
What is Israel's response to this?
Well, this is an enormously difficult question, I think, sitting here right now to answer. There are clearly a whole range of options open to Netanyahu. I think it's obvious he's going to do something. But I mean, if we go to one end of his range of options, we saw in April that all they did was mount a strike that took out an Iranian air defense radar, which actually helps guard their main nuclear site. So it was kind of sending a message, which then takes us right to the other end of the list of possible options. Well, okay, is this the moment that Israel is going to go for the Iranian nuclear program? If it does so,
go for it as in bomb it,
attempt to destroy it. Attempt to destroy it. Now, it is obvious that if that happens, there will be a very heavy Iranian response. And I was fascinated to hear one of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders saying, next time we go for infrastructure, well, given everything I've told you about the accuracy and the difficulty with hard military targets, it's much easier to hit a power station or an airport with some degree of accuracy. So there's lots of factors that would take the Iranians in that direction of just trying to plaster Israeli infrastructure, ports, airports, oil refineries, if they wanted to do an even bigger.
But you cannot destroy a nuclear facility, presumably, without massive amount of damage to the Iranian population.
Well, they're all the key ones, the famous sites that we know about, Natanz, various other places, Arak. They're in remote areas, and of course the main.
But don't they become radioactive?
Plant, well, you've got to consider all of that. It is deep underground. I mean, I think the real question about does Netanyahu listen to people like Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, who tweeted,
go?
Who's saying, right, go for the nuclear facilities. I think the real question is, can Israel on its own do this with a high degree of confidence that they've destroyed significant parts of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure? And because a lot of it is deep underground, I'm not sure they can. Yeah. Which is why, before all this started on the 7th of October last year, the kind of governing assumption among experts and regional analysts was, if this happens, and we know they do have pretty good intelligence, if they detect that Iran has decided to put a nuclear bomb together, it will be a joint US-Israeli operation, because there are capabilities. The American ability to penetrate deep targets, deep below the ground, is better. The Americans have other abilities like the stealth bomber and other things.
You cannot see the US getting involved in that a month out from the election, can you? I mean, honestly?
Well, I think that is clearly going to be the big constraint on Netanyahu in going for a target on that scale.
Can we just talk about Lebanon? Because this is all an asymmetric war as well, that Israel was targeted overnight, but the night before the invasion happened on the ground in Lebanon, purportedly, to finish off Hezbollah, but obviously this is affecting Lebanese civilians, and the Lebanese army is picking up the pieces there.
Well, it is inevitably the case. We've seen this in the sort of mini wars that Israel had with Gaza and with Lebanon, 2006, 2009. Some of these other times that the Israelis managed to keep control of many things when they were just doing airstrikes, but once they went in on the ground, there was a tendency for the number of people, civilians, to be killed to rise very much so. Yeah. Of course, they'll also lose soldiers in there, which will give some kind of win to Hizbollah in information warfare terms. They've done it. They seem to have had some quite serious battles with Hezbollah in the last 12 hours. It's really an open question as to what their objective is there. I mean, they've talked about this Litani river line, but good Lord, I mean, talk about history repeating itself. That in 1978, they did the sort of same invasion to try and drive Palestinian armed groups back from the border to the Litani river line. And there is a UN Security Council resolution in place, 1701 from 2006, which in theory means that Hezbollah shouldn't be south of that line. Yeah. So are they there simply to, if you like, push the diplomacy on and get that resolution 1701 imposed in some kind of meaningful way, then they'll get out? or as
I don't think of Hezbollah as being a group that particularly stick to UN resolutions.
No,
right?
of course. And also, as some of the wilier Israeli commentators have said during the past 24 hours, Israel is really good at getting into Lebanon, but not so good at getting out. Once the mission creep starts.
Emily just raised the question of Biden, and surely he's not going to do anything so close to the election. I want to ask a slightly different question. How much influence, if any, is he having over Israeli decision making? Because on the one hand, it seems that they're not having any influence, yet at the same time, US Air Force, the Royal Air Force, were involved last night in the defence of Israel. So do they have no say at all?
Well, they clearly do have a say, but I think the interesting thing with the current situation between Netanyahu and Biden, and I wrote about this in the Sunday Times last week, is the sense of a vacuum, the sense it can be exploited, because there's been some reporting that suggests that other people in the US administration basically gave the Israelis the thumbs up on these strikes which killed Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hizbollah. And so while publicly the Americans were cautioning against escalation, that other voices were saying, because of course, Hezbollah has a lot of American blood on its hands too, go ahead and do it. So you've got that complication. You've got the fact that Biden is very much on his way out. His faculties are weakened. There are moments, for example, I think there were moments early on in the Gaza invasion when it was probably to Netanyahu and Biden's mutual political interest to sort of fall out, for Netanyahu to ignore him and say to the Israeli public, I'll do whatever I have to do, and for Biden to say to the progressive side of the Democrat, well, I've tried. The one thing he did do, which was to pause some bomb deliveries, Biden, during the Gaza fighting, because of the fear that the Israelis were using really disproportionate attacks on the Palestinians in Gaza. If you pause those when you're fighting Hezbollah and Iran, then of course people will say, but you're just going to make sure Israel loses now, which in American
political terms is unacceptable.
Yeah, so it's a really hard thing to suddenly say we're going to cut everything off tomorrow.
Can I run one other theory past you? I have no knowledge on this. This is not my expertise, but this view that there is a schism in the Iranian leadership, that part of them gave away the location of the Hezbollah leader to the Israelis, to the Americans, because this is actually an internal battle within. Does that sound credible to you?
I don't know.
This came from someone who said they would never have found Nasrallah without a little bit of an insider tip-off.
Well, my reading of that would be, so when the Americans and the Brits and whatever were hunting the Al-Qaeda leaders, they had this thing called the kill cycle: find, fix, finish.
Yeah.
So you might be right
Bin Laden
about the find, that maybe some Iranian or some other dissident or someone said, he can be found often on this day of the week. But the fix is the really tricky thing.
Yeah.
You need someone to tell you he's arrived, or he's expected here in the next hour, or he will be here tonight for the meeting of the Supreme Council. And that tends to be someone on the ground with an intimate knowledge. It can be done electronically, but it tends to be someone who knows exactly what Nasrallah is about to do. And I think the evidence probably would point to someone within the Hezbollah family as being the person who would be most likely to be in possession of that intelligence.
So you're saying that it was somebody
in
Hezbollah?
No, my speculation would be that someone within, the inner circle of Hezbollah
would have sold him off. It doesn't happen by accident, is what you're saying.
Well,
nobody bumps him off by accident. It has to.
No, of course, it's a very elaborate and probably long-running operation to be in possession of that type of intelligence, and particularly the fix, the time and place. If they dropped 80 bombs on that complex and killed all those people living above it, and he hadn't been there, then it's a double disaster, isn't it?
Very excitingly, we can go live now to Birmingham. And Lewis Goodall is there, because he couldn't be bothered to be in the studio with us this morning. And Lewis, we've been hearing from all four candidates in their sort of final pitch to the Conservative Party conference.
Excuse me, it's just that the two of you decided to leave before the actual climax of this entire thing that it's all been leading towards. Some of us just got a bit more staying power. What were you doing this morning out of interest?
I was on Good Morning Britain.
Right. I see. Okay. You're on a different programme. Okay. No, fair play to you.
Were you there for any particular promotional reason, John Sopel?
I haven't spoken about my book for literally minutes now.
It all becomes clear.
I was waiting for a reference in one of the 4 speeches and it never ever came. Very, very sad. There was a moment.
So they've all failed in their own way.
Yeah.
Did none of them promote my book?
No.
No. They attacked James O'Brien rather than you. So, yeah, a bit of a
Next
bit of a
time.
shame. Next time, I'm sure it's coming. Yeah. Well, look, this was the climax of the conference, in the sense that obviously normally at the end of a Tory conference you would get the leader's speech, as we've been saying all week. They've not got a leader. It's the first, only the third time that a Conservative conference has not had a leader during its conference, basically since the conferences started. So they had this kind of slightly weird thing where all 4 gave what was supposed to be a 20-minute speech apiece. Turned out more to be like 30-minute, 35-minute speech apiece, where they just tried to make a last pitch really to the party members and set out their stall, and in each case either try and keep the momentum that they've gathered throughout the course of the last few days going, or try and rescue something. And I have to say, just on terms of the reaction in the hall, there was basically really only kind of one winner, and that was James Cleverly. The reaction to him, by comparison to the other 3, which went somewhere between kind of sort of vaguely kind of warmed all the way through right to tepid, Cleverly was by far and away had the best reaction in the hall on the day.
So that obviously is a mixture of the MPs that are still listening and the people who attended the conference, you might say the diehards. This will then go down to a choice of 2 from the Parliamentary Conservative Party, and from those 2 the membership chooses. So what's your reading, Lewis? I mean, let's just put money on the table at this point, shall we? Who are your 2?
I think that look, going into this conference, I think if you were to say, like, in order, who has had the best conference, Cleverly, clearly way out in front, has had the best conference, because these conferences are almost kind of designed to favour the underdog, like it did with David Cameron in 2005, someone breaking through. He's done that through a series of very assured speeches. Generic probably had the second best, in the sense he's still just about the front runner, but with a few stumbles. Tugan had the third best, in the sense that I think he needed that breakthrough moment. He needed to be the Cleverly, and he just wasn't. I think Cleverly's done now. And Badenoch has had the worst, because she was either right at the top with Generic or second best, and through a series of missteps, a series of fights and gaffes that she's decided to have, very sort of intrinsic in a way to her political profile, she stumbled back. So the word, I think, really, and the feeling here, talking to sort of MPs and other journalists and so on, is that now it has probably shifted from what we all thought would be a Generic Badenoch face-off to likely, although you can never be certain, obviously, a Generic Cleverly face-off. One thing you can absolutely guarantee as a result of the momentum that Cleverly's got, of course, is the next few days until that next ballot of Conservative MPs, just be prepared for a number of pretty negative press stories going on Cleverly's way, right? The other campaigns will be on the attack in a way which hitherto they have not done.
Yeah, Lewis, I'm fascinated by one word you used to describe Cleverly, which is the underdog. I mean, he was the Home Secretary. He was the Foreign Secretary. He was the party chairman. I mean, of those 4, he is far and away the
dog.
most senior. He's the big dog in the race. If he was the underdog, brilliant positioning by him to do so well. I also thought it was telling that in his kind of final pitch to the kind of the faithful, the people there still left in Birmingham, was to depict himself as a fully paid up member of the human race. Brackets, maybe unlike some of the others, close brackets.
Because leadership is about things like making the tough decisions. When you get that ugly phone call in the middle of the night about keeping this country safe. And because I've been there, because I know in detail what the government should be doing right now, I know in detail how they're failing. Now is not the time for an apprentice.
And it is part of his pitch as being this kind of quite blokey, avuncular, normalish kind of guy. He talks slightly oddly in the speech about his love of Warhammer, which again, I don't think anyone, whether that's normal or blokey, I'm not sure, but certainly it's kind of
very,
something.
as the mother of 2 sons, very, very normal. Right. Warhammer is like Airfix modelling. basically.
Yeah.
It's what all
Lewis
little
Goodall
boys
never
love
did.
doing.
Airfix modelling had gone well before Lewis Goodall was a child.
Well, that's why I was trying to update it.
yes, good. Well, this is the, but this is kind of like this is the split in a way, or the division, right? In particular between Cleverly and I suppose between him, Jenrick and Badenoch, those two. The diagnosis for both is basically for Cleverly is to essentially sort of say, steady as she goes. Let's not rock the boat too much. We don't need to come up with, a whole slew of new policies. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. The Labour Party are useless. Let's wait for them to screw up. A bit like what Starmer's policy was in 2010 with 2020 with regards to the Tories. Badenoch and Jenrick are saying something quite different. Badenoch and Jenrick, in different ways, they're coming up with a slightly different approach to do it. But they're both basically saying, look, the reason that we failed was because we were insufficiently conservative. We need to go back to first principles. And in Jenrick's case, is saying that the Conservative Party actually needs to be reborn in a very sort of nod to 1990s and New Labour, in a new Conservative Party, which actually, in fact, ends up sounding a little bit like the current Reform Party.
And I think this will now depend on whether the Tory members want somebody who makes them scared or want someone who makes them laugh. Because right now, they've got Keir Starmer doing all the pessimism. If you're worried about war, if you're worried about the economy, if you're worried about the exploding Middle East or the imploding, public finances, that is Starmer's problem. And I think where Cleverly has been quite clever is to say, I will unite, I will make you feel it's all okay. And I agree with everything you're saying. He is right in the middle of the catastrophe of the last government, as Foreign Secretary, as Home Office, as Chairman. He's been right in the middle of Tory failure. But right now, he's got these water bottles that say no leaks. He's trying to position himself as the slightly more cuddly candidate. And I think that the Tory membership might just go for that.
Well, it's interesting that the reaction to the Jenrick speech from Jesse Norman, former minister in the last government, was to say, and he puts this on social media, I am very sorry to have to say it, but that speech of Robert Jenrick's was lazy, mendacious, simplistic, tripe. I mean, I would say, Lewis, and I don't know whether you agree with this or not, but I would say that it's been every bit as calamitous for Jenrick as it has been for Kemi. I mean, Kemi's kind of just said a lot of things which have kind of that cause an eye roll. I have never seen the fury. I mean, Tom Tugendhat on Newsnight last night was extraordinary in piling in to Jenrick of those comments about the ECHR and special forces now having to kill rather than capture.
I don't think Jenrick's had a great conference. The only reason I would say that it's been better than, say, Tugendhat's is because Tugendhat, who is coming into this contest fourth, needed that kind of breakout moment and just hasn't had it. And Badenoch being so poor, as I say, that's why I would say Jenrick has probably done second best. Although, as I say, there is a big gap between Cleverly and Jenrick, I'd say. I think what you were saying there, Emily, about Cleverly being implicated in so much of this, it is right. But in a way, that is one of the threads which, watching the speeches this morning, really runs through all of the candidates, or a difficulty that all of the candidates face, which is how do you come to terms with the unease between the fact that the party has a record, a 14-year record, which has been rejected so absolutely by the electorate. They're all, to a greater or lesser extent, implicated in that. None of them have a clean skin. And none of them have found a form of words or a lens through which to analyse that failure and move on from it. Like, what's their theory of change? What have they got to say to the British people as to how the next Conservative government will be different from the last? And if you just think about like what all of their answers is to that question. So Cleverly is basically, we just need to be more united. He was the closest to come to say sorry for the record, although when you really kind of press him on it, the only thing he's really saying sorry for is the fact that the party was disunited. Not that, you had the worst living standards or declining living standards for 200 years, not the state of public services, whatever. Badenoch's approach is to say, we need to reinvent the British state from first principles. We need to basically kind of completely and utterly take out... She's basically saying that the Conservative Party was never in power in the first place, believe it or not, because the kind of Blair Brown legal settlement, the Human Rights Act, all of these things, our membership of the ECHR, all of that, she is basically saying that constrained us as Conservative governments from doing what we wanted to do.
Which is quite trussy. I mean, it's exactly what the truss line is. Yeah.
It's very, very trussy. And actually, I think it's just worth listening to some of what Badenoch's got to say, because it is really striking in that regard.
This stealthy poisoning of our society needs to stop. And let's face it, the Liberal Democrats are not going to defend our country. Unlike the left, we know right from wrong. But we allowed ourselves to be bound by aggressive identity politics, by a treasury whose rules were written by Gordon Brown, and a legal system re-engineered by Tony Blair. You may think Blair and Brown were defeated in 2010, but the truth is the left never left. It's time to make a change.
It's exactly what Liz Truss said in the hall. Exactly. That 14 years of Conservative rule have just disappeared in a puff of smoke, and actually all they're talking about is the Blair-Brown years, as if those had ended in July. It is extraordinary.
It's even weirder than that. She started to talk about repeatedly how the British state needed to be reprogrammed and how much of sort of British institutions needed to be reprogrammed. And this is not just kind of her diagnosis of why the last 14 years of Conservative government, in their own view, failed. It's because she thinks it's not just hers. It is a wider diagnosis of the right, and particularly the kind of like online right. And that's the thing that sometimes you're listening to with Badenoch in particular. You really get the sense of she does have some structural arguments which have some merit, and reasonable people can disagree about it. But you can also say like it's a very convenient excuse for a failed political project, right? And the fact that the Conservatives, for whatever reason, were unable to achieve their ends. And at worst, frankly, at times, it sounds positively McCarthyite and just really, in terms of winning over new voters,
Heritage Foundation, actually,
completely.
doesn't it? You know, it sounds
Project
like
25.
Project 25. I mean, without going too overboard on this, because that is a very specific, very American, very Trump thing to do with, you know, the whole State Department and all the rest of it. But it is, I think what it speaks to more than anything is that inability to look at what your part in any downfall has played.
Totally.
Look, I think the key test in this Conservative leadership election is, do they choose someone, because it's going to be the Conservative Party members who will make the ultimate choice, are they going to choose somebody who makes them feel good about their ideological predispositions and will make all those talking points their kind of the brand of their leadership of the Conservative Party, or are they going to want somebody who may reconnect with the British people and get them up from the 21% in 2024.
I'm interested in your theory. Okay, so we have obviously been in the bubble, the absolute bubble that is delightful Birmingham, where we've only seen how they've responded to people in the hall and to the press and all the rest of it. So we don't know about the rest of the wider Tory party membership. But what is your thinking is that it could come down to Cleverly and Tugendhat. In other words,
I wonder whether it's possible. I wonder whether it's just
because
conceivable.
You think Badenoch and Jenrick have both crashed and burned this week.
I mean, I'm sure there will be a standard bearer from the right.
Yeah.
But I would say that, you know, just on the kind of merit of it, of who's performed and really performed well and looked sure-footed, it's been Cleverly, clearly, by a mile, and Tugendhat hasn't really done that much wrong. Hasn't been fireworks, but it hasn't made mistakes in the same way that I think that Badenoch and Jenrick have.
I just don't think that in terms of the votes, the parliamentary votes, that they're there. That there's too much crossover between Cleverly and Tugendhat in terms of being slightly more on the sort of one nation wet part of the party. You know, that there's just going to be a candidate of the right. The only question is whether that is Badenoch or Jenrick, and it feels to me like it's going to be Jenrick.
So Emily and I spent the night together last night. Well, I mean, obviously not technically, but we were awake at the same time.
We? I didn't think we were. I set my alarm for 10 to 2. Did you watch it live?
Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah.
And then you had to do
I know.
your book promotion.
I don't like to talk about it.
No. Honestly, it's like trying to get blood out of a stone.
Please
just a single word about
Strangeland.
Yeah.
You called it Strangeland.
Strangeland. So we were watching the VP debate so that, as we say, you didn't have to. And we have got a whole episode for you on exactly what happened between Tim Walz and JD Vance between the hours of 2 and 4 this morning. And that is on our newsagent USA. And spoiler alert, it is not what you think. It was quite interesting, quite odd.
We'll be back tomorrow. See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.